Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the conveners for extending an invitation. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon whose country we meet today and acknowledge their elders past, present and future. And I'd also like to thank everyone who spoke this morning to provide the perfect launch pad for my conversation today with you all. So people who know me well will know I'm the perennial optimist. I'm always happy, smiling, whistling, because I've got the best job in the world. I look after the Great Barrier Reef for today's generation and for future generations. However, it's not without its challenges, as we've all heard this morning. It's a multiple-use marine park, and often trying to convey the size, the scope, and the complexity of the marine park to people is often challenging. So when you say that you're talking about an area that's larger than Japan, you can often hear the penny drop with some people. So it really is an extraordinary place. But the thing that often drives me balmy as an administrator is just how jurisdictionally complicated the marine park is. And I've been involved in natural resource management for 20 years, but when I came to GBRWHA after working in the Queensland public sector for 12 years as a wildlife manager, I felt like an absolute rank amateur because I had to relearn all the legislation that applied to the marine park. So if anyone thinks that getting things done is easy as a marine park manager, you might want to come and have a conversation with me over a beer. We're really managing a legacy of eroded resilience. So obviously a lot of the papers coming before me talked about the more modern things that we're seeing. But we need to cast our minds back 150 years plus to some of the patterns of behaviour that we exhibited back then based on the best available information. These are the legacies that we're still managing now. And I mean, if I just point out, if I get my little cursor to point, there was a commercial dugong harvest that started in Queensland in the mid-1880s, and didn't stop until 1969. So this is, when we think about an animal like a dugong and look at the populations now, we're not talking about pristine populations at all. We are talking about the management of a recovering population. And this is consistent across the landscape. One of the things we do incredibly well is document what's happening in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. We've got the Outlook report, and that provides a very, very clear platform about what are the major concerns and threats to the marine park. And obviously the one that's really kicking us in the guts at the moment is climate change. 2016 and 2017, unprecedented levels of mass coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef, and as Terry outlined this morning, significant mortality. And I'm the third person, I think, to show this graph this morning, but this is just really reinforcing that the landscape that we see is incredibly different compared to what we've seen from even 10 years ago. And that's before we start to bring in the other cumulative impacts, like severe tropical storms and cyclones. Since 2005, there have been 10 severe cyclones across the Great Barrier Reef. And this is just a map showing you the tracks of all of those cyclones. So that goes over and above the impacts of coral bleaching, of crown of thorns starfish, of the impacts of declining water quality. And this is the path of Tropical Cyclone Debbie from the 28th of March this year, rolling right over the top of Airlie Beach. The path that you can see there in the estimated width is over 500 kilometres. Just under 1,400 coral reefs are in that pathway. It's 28% of the reefs in the Great Barrier Reef are actually in the swathe of Tropical Cyclone Debbie. The independent expert panel in many ways summarised the current situation that we're in, and undoubtedly they're talking about the fact that damage is irreversible unless we take urgent action now. In many ways, I think, Terry, you encapsulated that more appropriately this morning, is that we are looking at a different future than what we've been looking at for a long period of time. So a business as usual approach is no longer an option for us. We need to think about the mixture of management options, including the foundational management, the resilience-based management, and quite possibly those left field things that are really, really weird, bizarre, things that you wouldn't have even talked about in hushed voices maybe 5 to 10 years ago, like geoengineering. It's interesting, though, that when I first came to the Marine Park 10 years ago, and I came from an area of Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and spent a lot of time on terrestrial parks, they are incredibly forthright about their management of those terrestrial area state properties. They burn them, they bulldoze them, they poison them, they shoot it, they build it. They have no hesitation in intervening at a variety of scales to drive particular management-orientated outcomes. And yet when I first came to the Marine Park Authority, some of those conversations were the ones that you had to have in a back room because people really hadn't embraced the nature or even the necessity of intervention and adaptive management in a marine context. And it's interesting to see how far we've come in the last 10 years. I work in this area called the joint field management. So if you're out in the marine park and you see one of our marine park vessels, this is the area that I work in. So I have that really interesting interface between sitting in an office and driving the more policy side of our business and then going out on the paddock and actually having a look at what's happening out in the marine park. The field management is a joint funded program, about 115 staff. We deliver activities across the full breadth of the marine park, both on the islands and in the water. We have a significant role in delivering some of the actions out of the long-term sustainability plan, and we are responsible for delivering a coordinated, comprehensive compliance program in the marine park. And I wanted to talk to you about some of the examples of adaptive management today. This is Curtis Island. This is just offshore of Gladstone. It's one of the largest islands in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. And in the northeastern part of Curtis Island, there is this extensive habitat called marine plains. It's listed as a regional ecosystem. It is an amazing place to go and have a look at. And if you're really interested in endangered species, this is an EPBC listed bird called the Capricorn yellow chat. That little red circle there shows the little bird in the marine plains. And if you're a bird nerd like I am, I have to say I was so excited to see some of these in the wild. So in terms of managing Curtis Island, one of the first things we needed to do is deal with 150 years of grazing pressure on the island, actually remove that grazing pressure. Oops. And then we needed to deal with the second range of things, which is how do you get that ecosystem moving back towards a more normal direction? And that's implementing those suite of actions. And you might look at that and think, well, what difference is that going to make? Well, the differences are astounding. So this is a photo of the marine plains from 2005, and that's the same location in 2016. So you can make a measurable difference at the ecosystem level scale in these terrestrial properties. And you can measure a range of things. The yellow chat population has absolutely bounced back really, really nicely. So I was there last year, and in one swoop of my binoculars, I managed to see 25 Dawson's chats or Capricorn yellow chats. So you can get the success stories. In the marine space, working with crown of thorns starfish and protecting a series of priority reefs, once again, that's been in action for quite a long time, and you can make measurable differences. The efficiencies that we've managed to do with moving between sodium bisulfate as an injection mechanism to bile salts, now to white vinegar, has meant almost a tenfold improvement in efficiency of controlling COTS. And in terms of, what have we done so far? 440,000 plus crown of thorns starfish killed since July 2012. And probably one thing that I'm most excited about is a little place called Raine Island in the northern Great Barrier Reef. It supports the world's largest aggregation of nesting green turtles out of the world's largest remaining population of green turtles. So in a big season at Raine Island, you can have upwards of 60,000 females in the waters waiting to come ashore to nest. It's also the most significant seabird rookery along the eastern Australian seaboard. But it's not without its problems. We've got lots and lots of turtles falling over the cliff and dying, getting wedged in beach rock. And now, unfortunately, the sand on the island has changed shape, and a lot of the island actually gets inundated at high spring tides by seawater. And we get females like this laying her eggs in water, which is obviously highly undesirable because the eggs all die. So in terms of adaptive management there, we started with the safe to fail or no regrets options. Pretty easy stuff. You put in something like a dedicated mooring for your vessel, which means you can go there more frequently, more safely and more efficiently. Put in some cliff top fencing to stop the turtles toppling over the side. I mean, we're not talking about complicated solutions here, ladies and gentlemen. This is the cheapest of cheap solutions that you can implement. But it's highly effective. This area behind me here, I'm showing, we used to refer it to it as the wall of death, because in a big season, you would have 60 to 200 turtles falling off that cliff and dying. We put the fencing in and we reduced that to 2 in a single season. So you can make measurable differences through intervention. Rescue turtles on the beach and stop them from dying in the sun. And you can get really courageous and you can land big machinery on the island and you can build experimental beach reprofiled areas to test whether or not you can actually raise the nests above tidal mark. Got to tell you that this took us nearly 10 years of hard graft to get people to accept this as an intervention option on this particular location. So given the current status of the reef, how do we drive that change management process? And I'd really like to thank Tiffany for her thought-provoking presentation about that governance and policy space, because it's one of those areas where we really need to build on. And Terry as well alluded to the fact that we can't keep on doing business as usual. It's not going to work. A couple of weeks ago, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority hosted a Reef Resilience Summit. We had 70 participants from all around the world and locally coming along. And I've got to say, it was in many ways, it was an inspirational couple of days because of people's willingness to engage, people's willingness to recognise that there was a real imperative to act now because the landscape had changed so significantly in response to the coral bleaching events. And in many ways, that was the core objective of pulling that Resilience Summit together, was to actually develop a blueprint for how we move forward. And once again, I'm the third person to talk about blueprints today. Terry mentioned it, Tiffany mentioned it. This is what we need to do if we're going to make a measurable difference. Not surprisingly, the group of 70 people in the room, we talked about those additional actions that we could do to make a difference. And I've got them up there on the board. That's the sort of concise summary of those. But a lot of those are very action-orientated, out on the paddock, trying to make a difference. But probably the things that we often overlook that I think are really, really critical is focusing on partnerships and stewardships. I mean, as a marine park manager standing up and talking to a group of arguably some of the world's best researchers, making sure we've got clear collaboration between those that need the information to make informed decisions and those that are collecting the information to inform those decisions is really, really crucial. I think there's a bunch of future challenges that are going to face us all, and we won't have a monopoly on that as being marine park managers. And I've just put a couple of those up there for people just to think about. For me, part of it is socialising the need for intervention, because a lot of people think that we don't need to do that. You know, why should we do that? And trying to convince them that the imperative is now is really, really important. I know I used 2 examples out of the terrestrial landscape this morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I can appreciate people might be sitting back thinking about obviously the differences between managing a terrestrial landscape with all its idiosyncrasies about connectivity and your capacity to influence change versus marine landscapes. But we really need to start thinking about how we apply the information and the knowledge that we've learned from the terrestrial landscape across into the marine world, because that's where we really need to focus. And particularly, how do we scale up things that we can conduct at a local scale to those that we can conduct at ecologically meaningful scales? You know, thinking about the Barrier Reef, and this is a beautiful photograph, Raine Island and all its beauty, how are we going to leave a legacy for future generations, ladies and gentlemen? And for me, and I was reading the program, I just happened to take a little excerpt out of there from Terry's forward. You know, to me, this is the message that I'd like to leave everybody with. You know, there has never been a more urgent need to take a multidisciplinary approach to protect the coral reefs of the world and the Great Barrier Reef for current and future generations. Thank you.